And bad morning, everybody. This is the 18th of September, 2018, and the 42nd episode of Bad Morning News, where we will now tell you the meaning of life. No, just kidding. And copyright protected. But yeah, I'm back today. I'm your host, Lupinate, with the big flame ball. We've got Cryptic in again. And unfortunately, Jeremiah is not available at the moment, still trying to sort out his accommodations, while our good friend Dexter is currently gainfully employed and will be hosting at a different time. So be aware there'll be another channel or another set of events that'll be going on. We'll be looking for more hosts, and these will be happening around 5:30 Central Time. So if you've got time to broadcast around then and fancy covering some news stories like we amateurs have been doing here, feel free. Give us a bell, join the Discord chat, and we'll vet you, see if you're capable of doing the job that we're gamefully trying to do. And I figured today I'd be hitting up a bit on Europe in particular, but I thought it'd be worthwhile starting with something fairly basic back from the States, which amused me greatly. It's from the Washington Times, courtesy of Danielle, who's a common and avid follower of the show at the moment. She sent us this, published today, Monday, by Valerie Richardson. How liberals rush to blame Trump for hurricane activity is debunked by science. Debate rages over the role of human-caused global warming in driving storms. So I didn't realize that there were people actually blaming Trump for Hurricane Florence, Trump for Florence's existence. Anyway, meteorologist Roy Spencer has just two problems with the ongoing climate change narrative, blaming President Trump for making hurricanes worse. First, the president can't control hurricanes. And second, they're not getting worse. Even before Hurricane Florence made landfall Friday in North Carolina, Mr. Trump was being decried on the left for exacerbating storm activity, a superpower attributed to his enthusiastic support for fossil fuels and dismantling of Obama-era climate regulations. Leading the charge was the Washington Post, which accused Trump in an editorial last week with being, quote, complicit in Hurricane Florence, a theme echoed Sunday by the New York Times in an editorial faulting the president for ignoring the, quote, linkage between hurricanes and his policy rollbacks. Another hurricane is about to batter our coast. Trump is complicit, send the September 11th headline in the Post. Interesting they would do that on 9/11. Swinging back were scientists like Mr. Spencer, principal research scientist at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and former NASA senior climate scientist, who denounced such claims as, quote, obscene attempts to make political points, and even in the face of no evidence. The fact there has been no long-term change in global hurricane activity, and even a 50% decrease in U.S. landfalling major hurricanes over the last 80 years, which means no one is complicit in these storms, said Mr. Spencer, author of Inevitable Disaster, Why Hurricanes Can't Be Blamed on Global Warming. On the contrary, the U.S. hurricane front has recently set records for inactivity. No major hurricanes defined as Category 3 or larger made U.S. landfall for more than 11 years, ending with Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And no hurricanes entered or developed in the Gulf of Mexico for a 3-year period, ending in 2016, both the longest gaps in recorded history. University of Colorado Boulder professor Roger A. Pielke Jr., who has written extensively on hurricanes, posted a graphic last week showing that U.S. landfalling hurricanes declined from 1900 to 2017. Most people simply don't believe that U.S. landfalling hurricanes, overall and major, are down since 1900, within population, but not significantly if taken as a sample. Mr. Pielke tweeted, I found these graphs get people riled up, but it's just data. Why the media alarm? Quote, it's because people are informing us in the media about global warming are people like Al Gore, Bill Nye the Science Guy, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, people that don't know anything about atmospheric science, Mr. Spencer said on Fox's Tucker Carlson tonight. There's more to this article. I've covered roughly about a third of it. It goes into details around Hurricane Florence prior to the landfall, and more into some of the scientific reasons why this is just absolute bunkum. You can't blame one man for bloody hurricanes. As much as you might like to, no man controls the weather. I mean, this ain't a bloody Marvel superhero comic that we live in. It's the real world, people. It's not some. Trump is not a god king. He is just a man. Please accept that. For once, I'm begging you. What's your thoughts, Cryptic?
Yeah, it's funny to me. This kind of seems like the left wing version of like a Pat Robertson type, where he says, you know, God is punishing America with hurricanes for homosexuality or whatever. This is like the liberals saying God is, or science or whatever is punishing the U.S. with hurricanes for having Trump, an unbeliever in human climate change. So it's just kind of their own version of a religious type belief in their own pet issues, I think.
I think it's worth calling it a religion at this point as well, simply because it's it's turning into one, unfortunately. Yeah, it's not it's not valid. None of these claims that Trump is causing climate change are 100 are remotely valid. His efforts may create the conditions where climate change could be exacerbated if it even happens. But that's something a large body of people, including scientists in multiple fields, including the climate fields, would say is inaccurate in a number of different ways. And there are physicists who outright declare it pseudoscience. So, but we're not, I'm not going to go into a hour-long discussion on climate change, especially as I think we're both in agreement that it's not necessarily as big a deal as everybody makes it out to be.
Yeah, I just can't even believe they'd make the claim so soon. I mean, really, he's been in office 2 years. I mean, do they really think it even happens that fast? They just show themselves to be ridiculous making that type of claim.
Well, precisely. I mean, it takes what, about 8 years for a set of policies to actually come to any real sense of fruition. And that's mainly why you start seeing changes actually occurring partway through a president's second term, not his first. And it's also part of the reason I personally believe that there's always that political downshift midterm in a president's first election season. It seems to work around this premise. People expect the president to do something quickly. President can't do something quickly. Approval of the president drops during the midterms. This is roughly how most presidencies trend. And then they start to improve as people start to see changes actually occurring. Or they start to see what is preventing those changes that they wanted from occurring. In either case, they do tend to see an uptick if he retains the seat, which is more often than not. And the thing that gets me about the whole argument, particularly with Trump, is that if Trump is being blamed for this, why wasn't Bush also blamed for hurricanes? Why wasn't all of the other presidents who failed to deliver on actually reducing the overall impact of CO2 on the overall environment blamed for this? Why hasn't the EPA, for example, been blamed for this in general or in specific, given the fact they're supposed to be responsible for the environment's protection? If it's insufficient to protect the environment the way that's being protected now, why do we continue using these solutions? But that's just me. And I think just quickly, as we've got a couple from camp on this issue, it's as if he's has transcended humanity and become some kind of elemental evil. It seems to be the leftist view with regards to Trump. And I'd agree with that. I'd say that they have effectively demonized the man, and not for reasons that one should actually demonize him for, but for a bunch of really strange and unusual reasons that are often strawman. most of the greenhouse gases come from China, who gets a pass. And that is also true because they're a developing world, they get to produce more of it. And it's a bit frustrating. But yeah, that's in a nutshell the, shall we say, the more light-hearted piece today. Cryptic, why don't you hit that one about the I'm trying to think which one's better here. Let's go with that one from the Free Thought Project that you brought up.
The New Mexico one or the
Actually, yeah, let's go with the New Mexico one for now. I think we'll leave the police issue for a little bit later to leave everybody with a bad taste in their mouth.
Yeah. Yep. All right. This is from the Free Thought Project by Matt Agrist. New Mexico suing Google and Twitter for knowingly and illegally exploiting children online. The state of New Mexico has filed a lawsuit against Google and others for willfully breaking the law to exploit the collection of children's data online. As YouTube, Google, and Twitter crack down on peaceful channels, censor alternative media, and allow child exploitation videos to flourish, New Mexico has filed a lawsuit against them and several app developers for illegally collecting data from children under the age of 13 without parental consent. According to UPI, New Mexico Attorney General Balderas said the companies are violating the 1998 Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, a federal law, by collecting and selling the data on children. These apps can track where children live, play, and go to school with incredible precision, Balderas said of the insidious practice. These multi-million-dollar tech companies partnering with app developers are taking advantage of New Mexican children, and the unacceptable risk of data breach and access from third parties who seek to exploit and harm our children will not be tolerated in New Mexico. Tiny Lab Productions, MoPub, AirServe, InMobi PTE, AppLovin, and Iron Source are also named in the lawsuit. The lawsuit comes on the heels of a study that showed over 6,000 apps violate COPPA regulations. As the Free Thought Project reported earlier this year, YouTube was already found to be in violation of COPPA when an independent coalition of advocacy groups conducted their own investigation. The coalition is made up of groups including the Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood, the Center for Digital Democracy, and 21 other organizations. Within their complaint, the coalition alleges that despite Google claiming YouTube is only for children 13 years and over, it knows younger children use the site and it targets them illegally. According to COPPA, it is illegal for any operator of a website or online service or a portion thereof that is directed to children or that has actual knowledge that it collects information from children from collecting, using, or disclosing personal information from a child unless the operator gives parents notice of its data collection practices and obtains verifiable parental consent before collecting the data. However, according to the complaint filed by the coalition, Google is knowingly violating this law. According to the complaint, YouTube also has actual knowledge that many children are on YouTube, as evidenced by disclosures from content providers, public statements by YouTube executives, and the creation of the YouTube Kids app, which provides additional access to many of the children's channels on YouTube. YouTube even encourages content creators to create children's programs. Through the YouTube Partner Program, YouTube and creators split revenues from advertisements served on the creators' videos. YouTube's privacy policy discloses that it collects many types of personal information, including geolocation, unique device identifiers, mobile phone numbers, and persistent identifiers used to recognize a user over time and across different websites or services. YouTube collects this information from children under the age of 13 and uses it to target advertisements without giving notice or obtaining advanced verifiable parental consent as required by COPPA. The coalition is now asking that the FTC step in and investigate the internet giant for these violations. Jeff Chester of the Center for Digital Democracy said Google has acted duplicitously by falsely claiming in its terms of service that YouTube is only for those who are 13 or older, while it deliberately lured young people into an ad-filled digital playground. Just like Facebook, Google has focused its huge resources on generating profits instead of protecting privacy. As the Free Thought Project has reported, children are the last ones YouTube appears to be concerned with, instead targeting those who dare challenge the status quo. All right, so that's the gist of the article there. Again, not surprising to me to know that they're not going out of their way to get verified parental consent. Unfortunately, to me, that kind of just rings just like a lot of their policies where people kind of just click agree and don't read it. I mean, you can't really. There's no to me, I can't think of a really practical way of verifying parental consent in that context. But of course, that doesn't excuse their practices, and unsurprising given what they do. I mean, they're monetizing who and at whatever they can, and children today are just the next frontier, I suppose.
The thing that gets me about is in Britain, for example, and in Europe, just in general, but specifically, I'm going to refer to the UK legislation on this. It has been illegal ever since I joined the industry, which was a good 10 years ago for advertising, to target anybody under the age of 18. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't companies who've tried it. I did go to meetings where people were asking, can you provide us any solutions to target teenagers between 13 and 15? And said, no, that's illegal. I said, yeah, but surely you can do it. Yes, we could do it, but we're not going to. It's illegal. It's not something we wish to risk our company's reputation or financial security for. And eventually, such companies would back down because they realized we were being principled. They also often didn't have any viable security measures, and we'd have to judge them quite harshly as a result, not provide their data to anybody because it was no possible way for us to secure it properly. But that's beside the point. Those issues that we had over here were dealt with quite easily. Nobody would surface the data on anybody who didn't have a known age, and that age had to be over 18. And if you tried, the big platforms would block it. This is something that it took them a while to eventually do, but the whole time, data providers weren't allowed to provide data under a certain age bracket, even if they collected it. And in America, the same laws sort of exist, but they're much more flexible. It's down to, I think, about 13 is the age limit that you're allowed to reach out to or something without parental consent first and foremost. But nobody really seems to give a damn about parental consent. If your parents gave you a phone, they assume that your parents consent to whatever you do on that phone. And that's not the case. I'm sure most parents wouldn't consent to their kid giving away credit card details or anything of that nature to some rando in the internet because they're going to provide them some kind of service that they want. It's not really an option because they aren't making any money. So you're not going to be able to justify financial purchases that way. And trying to justify targeting that way is even worse because kids will not understand all the ins and outs of advertising. They largely are, especially nowadays, taught to believe what they're told. And as a result, they'll believe the advertising that they're saying, that this is good for you and makes you feel good and you'll be better off for having it. And when all of that could be a lie. And that's why I'm actually very glad New Mexico is suing these companies for breaching the law and breaching what I would consider to be ethics of any sort, to be honest. You don't target children. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, as far as to the extent there are laws against what they're doing in place, I definitely think they should be held to the fire. I echoing one thing you mentioned, I think most people don't give a shit, and that's the main problem. Whether it's adults, just not caring about anything regarding all of these companies injecting themselves into our lives, and they're just passing that on to their children. Growing up in this world where you're just a commodity to advertisement being sold shit all the time. Just like kind of made me think about. Correct me if this is incorrect, but as far as I know, the United States and maybe one other country are the only ones that allow pharmaceutical companies to directly advertise their pharmaceutical drugs on TV, for example. And like I've grown up my whole life seeing all these fucking ridiculous drug commercials on TV, and that I think that feeds into the culture of people just looking to these drugs for instant cures or not. I mean, they don't cure instant treatments, always looking for the next drug to give them whatever. Whereas in places where that's not allowed, I guess maybe that culture is different. Not to say that I necessarily support governments are arbitrarily deciding what is allowed to be broadcast and not, but just as far as the culture goes, that's just one observation that I had.
When it comes to things like over-the-counter medications, that's not necessarily the case. So when like ibuprofen, Advil, or any kind of drug that you would normally buy in a pharmacy or a supermarket potentially, that kind of thing is not really heavily regulated. You have to be able to prove the claims you make in it are true, but usually that's done with a little blurb at the bottom that uh, has a little asterisk against it saying 70% of 100 surveyed or something along those lines. As long as there's some significance to the data, then people will, or the advertising standards boards will allow it. When it comes to things like prescription medication, ask your doctor kind of messaging like you have in the States, where side effects could include homicidal tendencies, wanting to commit suicide, wanting to commit suicide after committing homicide, all of these various forms of violent trends that seem to emerge from taking drugs that are supposed to make you more peaceful. These aren't allowed to be advertised in much of Europe. Probably a fair portion of South America. I'd be very surprised if they'd be allowed anywhere. It's a very American kind of culture to have those kinds of items being widely advertised as things that will benefit society or you in specific. And I don't agree with the fact the state's regulating it, but I don't see that being something that would change culturally if the state stopped regulating it either. People over here don't have the same uh, tendency towards taking a pill to resolve a problem. They're more likely to try other solutions because they don't trust the pills more often than not to do the job properly or to only do the job when it's really bad, which is, to be quite frank, how you should treat pills. You shouldn't be treating them as things you say, oh, I've got a little bit of a backache, better take an Advil. No, my back is killing me. I better take an Advil. That's a bit closer to like what you should be dealing with on drugs, because otherwise you're going to develop a resistance to it and you're going to wind up making it completely useless. You'll need to take stronger and stronger pain relief just to get rid of a little niggle. And it's not worth it.
Yeah, thanks for clearing that up. That definitely makes a lot of sense, and I definitely do see that culture here, or the culture of going to pills as a first uh, response to anything. So yeah, it definitely makes a lot of sense.
It's been going on for a long time, I have to admit. It's not something that's been that recent, although I'll be quite frank, it has scaled up immensely in the past 10, 20 years. It never used to be like this when I was a kid. There was maybe the occasional commercial, usually, oddly enough, if I remember correctly, for herpes medications. I don't quite know why, but those were the things that tended to be all foot treatments. It was very basic sort of things, conditions that would affect a small niche market, usually, or fairly large ones that don't like to talk about things. And then all of a sudden, like around the 90s and the noughties, it kicked off big time. It really started to ramp up. And then after I left the country and came back, it was every commercial break had at least one product placement for a mental health drug, at least one. And sometimes there'd be three. And I'd just wait for the side effects include bits so that I and my wife would be with me at this time. We'd both be laughing our asses off. How could anybody take this stuff? Because side effects include vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, and it'll be a stomach treatment. And you're like, wait, what? These are the things that you're trying to prevent with this drug, and yet they're causing the same symptoms in a subset of people. What? Huh? How is this? How does anybody consider this to be more than a placebo effect? If your side effects are the same thing as what you're trying to treat, it just doesn't make sense to me. But again, this is a nation that has grown up where marketing is actually more important than the product in this particular market. And that is the God's honest truth. It's all about the marketing at the moment when it comes to uh, drug advertising.
Yeah, and definitely a topic we could spend a long time getting into, probably.
Yeah, very true. But I think we should probably change gears a little bit and discuss Europe because this actually hits me quite heavily. So thankfully, in a good way, for the first article we'll be bringing up, this is bad news for Europe and European people who wish to try and work in Britain, unless they're highly skilled. UK visas, EU workers after Brexit, quote, should get no special treatment. And this was published today by the BBC. Workers from the European Economic Area should be subject to the same visa requirements as other migrants to the UK after Brexit, a government commissioned report on migration says. However, the Migration Advisory Committee does not rule out offering EEA workers preferential treatment as part of the Brexit negotiations. It also recommends scrapping limits on higher skilled migrants to the UK. The government has said it will carefully consider the proposals. The report says there is no evidence that increased European migration has damaged life in the UK. It concludes that EU migrants pay more in tax than they receive in benefits, contribute more to the NHS workforce than the healthcare they access, and have no effect on crime rates. Now, pay attention to the wording. EU migrants. It's not mentioning other regions or people who are traveling from say, Syria or Libya via the EU. It's specifically mentioning EU migrants. And to a large extent, I have to agree with that assessment. I've worked with a number of people who've come over from the EU, particularly the Eastern European region of the EU. They often are unbelievably highly skilled when they come to Britain, and they pull more than their own weight in a number of cases. When it comes to lower skilled jobs, there is a, shall we say, a standard of quality that is apparent between different cultures when it comes to, say, building and construction. They do a good job, they do what is put in front of them, but they do take shortcuts in a lot of cases. And unless they're told to work a specific way, they will tend towards making those shortcuts in the smaller business market. Anyway, MAC chairman Professor Alan Mering said the overall impacts of EEA migration has not had the big costs that some people claimed, but has not had the big benefits either. So it's a bit of a net nothing. Um, the Migration Advisory Committee report is a massive piece of work, and the caveats and cautions that it places around its findings show how fiendishly complicated the topic is. While it says the EEA migrants put more into the economy than they take out, this masks considerable variations, and the fall in value of the pound since the Brexit has had a greater overall effect on the wealth of the nation. Mac finds a link between rising migration and house prices, but then stresses that affordability is also linked to other government policies and planning woes in some areas. So the subtext of the report is that when it comes to migration, there needs to be less seat and more reflection. And one of the things that the report also made a mention of, as I said, is a reduction in or a removal of the cap on highly skilled workers. Current policy is to allow 20,700 highly skilled workers into the UK each year from outside the EEA. They're granted a Tier 2 visa to work in the country. Top priority is given to jobs on a shortage occupation list, which include geophysics, mining engineers, 3D computer animators, games designers, cybersecurity experts, emergency medicine consultants, and pediatric consultants. So if this is part of the reason why I actually would have qualified originally as a high skilled migrant when I came over here. It's because I was in computing, and at the time there was a shortage of developers, particularly games designers, and there still is. And I had done a lot around that. The government says it will listen to the report and put in an immigration system that works for the whole of the UK. The government is clear that EU citizens play an important and positive role in our economy and society. We want that to continue after we leave, a Home Office spokeswoman said. Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott said the UK's immigration policy needs to be based on our economic needs while maintaining our legal obligations and treating people fairly. This means ending the discrimination against non-EU migrants, especially from the Commonwealth. And I'll put to you, I'm going to stop it there because there's a lot more in the EU that's going on at the moment. But one of the things I will make mention of is when I first came over to Britain, I came over to study as well as to live. And when I started, it was still cheaper than studying in the States. Bear that in mind, at least 50% cheaper to study here, an equally difficult degree in a very different way than it was to study a similar scientific degree in the States. So from a cost perspective, it was a no-brainer. This was the only way I could really afford it long term to actually get a degree, was to go to Britain. That's how bad it was back in 2000, in the 2000 era. I can only imagine just how bad it is for most university grads now. But when I came over here, I was paying the full tuition because I was an American. I was not an EU citizen. And EU citizens, as well as British citizens, basically got a much reduced rate. And British citizens, shortly before I came over here, didn't have to pay a penny towards their education for a very long time. And that's how the universities they got a huge bursary basically from the government for this. It wasn't enough in the end, and the universities eventually had to start charging tuition. But at first, that was at most 50% of the cost of tuition would still be paid for by the government, unless you were outside the EU, in which case you still had to pay the whole hog. So to be quite frank, from a fairness perspective and a free market perspective, I'm all for this. This is everything that is good about a free market. You don't get preferential treatment in any situation. You don't get reduced costs in any situation. Everybody has the same chance, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, it sounds pretty interesting. I'm still not very versed in commenting on these, so I'll let you continue talking about it. You know so much more, so I'll sit here and listen.
That's fair enough. Now, I'm gonna also tackle a fairly topical news story for Europe. Now, some of you, probably not many, if you're coming from the States, no offense, man, are probably unaware of Hungary's current issues in the EU. They're being quite heavily attacked by the rest of the Union at the moment. This is from Brussels Bureau of the European News by Daniel Bellamy. Hungary rejects EU's charge that its democracy is weakening. Hungary's far-right leader has rejected a report by the EU which says the country is failing to respect the rule of law. In a speech to Parliament on Monday, Prime Minister Viktor Orban promised that Hungary would now take legal action against the report. Brussels says it's also concerned about the weakening of other democratic values, such as the freedom of expression and the rights of minorities and migrants. This report can only be described as an absurd collection of lies. The way it was adopted clearly infringes the statute of the European Union. Even a law student can see that, Orban said. They want to initiate proceedings against a member state citing so-called rule of law deficiency by ignoring themselves basic rule of laws. On Wednesday, the European Parliament voted to sanction Hungary for flouting EU rules. Sorry, jump there. Sorry about that. On Wednesday, the European Parliament voted to sanction Hungary for flouting EU rules on democracy, civil rights, and corruption. It was an unprecedented step that left Orban isolated from some powerful allies in the European Parliament. However, Hungary is unlikely to be suspended from voting in the EU since Poland and the Czech Republic said they would back Orban and veto any sanction against Hungary. Since he came to power in 2010, Orban has used his parliamentary majority to pressure courts, media, and non-government groups in ways his opponents say breach European Union rules. He has been one of the strongest opponents of the EU's migration policies. The leftist opposition of the Democratic Coalition and the Socialists and Párbeszéd Dialogue Party is in disarray after Orban won a third that's where it ends, actually. Unfortunately, I think they finished writing it a little bit early. But yeah, he won a third term. Orban has been a thorn in the EU side for quite some time, and they have been keen to try to find ways of censoring him. But to be quite frank, like they said, Poland and the Czech Republic is equally annoyed with the EU, as is much of Britain. Particularly UKIP party, which for whatever reason, ironically is one of the larger groups within the European Parliament from Britain. I always found that unbelievably amusing that the largest anti-EU faction, which actually had parliamentary members, had more parliamentary members in the European Parliament than the actual parliament of their own country. That just always confused the heck out of me, but hey. But yeah, even they are starting to, well, not starting, even they are increasing their level of venom for the EU. Exclusive from the Express, furious MEPs tear apart Juncker's speech shows he is, quote, away with the fairies. So yeah, they're not pulling punches anymore. European MEPs found common ground this week as they tore apart Jean-Claude Juncker's last speech as European Commission leader, coming together to condemn his calls for, quote, more Europe in the face of growing dissent. Chief Eurocrat Jean-Claude Juncker delivered his last State of the Union speech in Strasbourg on Wednesday before stepping down at the end of his mandate in 2019. Mr. Juncker urged member states to reject the temptation of nationalism, to embrace more European form of patriotism, a demand that appeared to unite MEPs from across the European Union against Juncker. Brexiteer Dan Hammond accused the commissioner of, quote, prescribing more of the medicine that sickened the patient, attacking his plans to speed up integration among the remaining members. Speaking exclusively to the Express, the aftermath of the State of the Union speech, Mr. Hannan said, quote, Juncker's answer to everything is more Europe. Immigration crisis, get rid of the borders, more Europe. Populist parties rising on the continent, more integration, more Europe. Brexit, speed up our plans for a military and physical integration, more Europe. When is he going to realize that prescribing more of the medicine that sickened the patient in the first place? Fellow Conservative MEP Ashley Fox appeared to be of a similar mind, advising Mr. Juncker to accept that the heavy presence of European influence on national matters is fueling the unhappiness of EU citizens. Mr. Fox described Mr. Juncker as a, quote, tired man whose only proposal includes dialing up the role of the EU in the continent. Quote, I think it was a very tired speech from a very tired man, and his answer to every question is more Europe. It doesn't matter what the question is, his answer is always more Europe. He doesn't get it. I think the lesson is that the European Union has to learn is that the problem is not that there isn't enough Europe, the problem is that there is already too much Europe. That is what causes European citizens to be discontented. Tory politician added, the people in Britain voted to leave the EU because the EU intrudes too much into the nooks and crannies of national life. And if the EU follows Mr. Juncker's prescription, if there is more Europe, a European defense identity, more qualifying major votes on foreign policy, we will see more people getting upset at the EU, and that is not the way I want to see it. I'm going to finish this off on Nigel Farage's comments on it. Nigel Farage, a vocal opponent of Mr. Juncker's plans for more integration and a key architect of the Brexit referendum, branded as, quote, bizarre, the Eurocrats' calls for, quote, patriotism, as he warned that further consolidation within Europe could threaten the sovereignty of member states. Mr. Farage told the Express, quote, if you're patriotic to your nation state, that's bad. That's nationalism, that's evil, that's xenophobic. But if you're patriotic towards the European flag, that's good and virtuous. I mean, it's absolutely bizarre. What they want is they want all of us in Europe to sign a new form of identity. They want us to say we're Europeans first and we're German second or French second. All the evidence is that this is not what people want. So, yeah. Basically, even the MEPs are starting to lose their cool on all of this, particularly the British ones. It also transcended borders, however. The disappointment appeared to transcend borders, with Italian MEP Fabio Castellato also coming out strongly against the speech for failing to address key issues such as migration, despite growing dissent within the bloc's management of the situation. Mr. Castaldo said he expected a, quote, much braver approach from Mr. Juncker. Unfortunately, we were quite disappointed by Mr. Juncker's speech. It was his last speech of the State of the Union, and we were waiting for a much stronger and braver approach to tackle the issue of migration. Apparently, another one, Mr. Henkel, within I think probably still within Britain, was blasting Juncker for providing Michael Barnier a blank check on Brexit. He's the one who was dealing with the negotiations. German MEP Hans-Olaf Henkel also voiced his criticism of the speech, lamenting Mr. Juncker had given EU chief Brexit negotiator a blank check to negotiate Brexit without taking under consideration the economic risks to the continent. Mr. Henkel said, I was very disappointed by President Juncker giving a blank check to Mr. Barnier, and I've met Barnier only yesterday again, and I think he thinks he is some sort of Ayatollah. He totally ignores the economic impact of Brexit on Europe. He seems very eloquent in all the impacts of Brexit on Britain, but he's totally deaf to the bad impact on Europe. If he was more amenable to the realities of the economic impact on Europe, he would give Britain a better deal than today. I appealed to him to be more generous to the British, and of course the best thing would be to give the British what they always wanted without Brexit, more autonomy on immigration. It's more than what we wanted, but it is part of it. So yeah, basically everybody is getting pissed off with the EU, and to round off of public finance now, how the EU is to do what it's supposed to be doing in the first place. He feels that air pollution is auditors by Simone Wrench on the 11th of September. Inadequate action to curb air pollution in European Union is incurring hundreds of billions of euros in health-related costs, auditors have warned. In a report released today, the European Court of Auditors said the bloc's actions to protect human health from air pollution had not been effective. They examined the EU's 2008 Ambient Air Quality Directive and other EU policies supported by funding to see whether clean air had been prioritized. They found that some air quality standards, which were set almost 20 years ago, were much weaker than World Health Organization guidelines. Most member states do not comply with the block standards or take enough action to improve air quality, the report says. It noted that the EU funding for air quality was not always sufficiently targeted in projects by member states. Janusz Wojciechowski, I think, a member of the ECA, said air pollution is the biggest environmental risk to health in the EU. In the recent decades, EU policies have contributed to emission reductions, but air quality has not improved at the same rate, and there are still considerable impacts on public health. Every year, air pollution causes about 400,000 premature deaths in the EU and hundreds of billions of euros in health-related external costs, the ECA report says. The auditor warns that nitrogen dioxide and ground-level ozone are responsible for most of the early deaths from air pollution, and that people in urban areas are particularly exposed. They called for the bloc to take, quote, more effective action and update the directive, as well as mainstream air quality in its policies and raise public awareness. Now, personally, I think that's still going down the wrong route, but we all know I'm an anarchist. But it does show that even the EU, not only can the EU not have policies that are fit to purpose according to much wider bodies that are more internationally recognized as fit for purpose solutions, but it also is unable to actually make those regulations and rules stick for member states. So the member states just ignore them, it sounds like, according to this article, if they choose. And I know Britain has air quality acts that are, I think, more rigorous than most of the EU ones. I'm not saying that we don't still have significant air pollution. And depending on the wind patterns, we also get extra pollution from places like the Sahara. But then again, so does Texas. And it's important to recognize that when it comes to air pollution, it's not just one country that you have to pay attention to. Air does not just sit in one place and never move. There's winds, there's all sorts of activity. And you can do the research yourself. I've done it. You can look up the Sahara Desert's dust and see it moving all over the place in satellite photos. You can view all sorts of information when it comes to air pollution and how some pollution in one location can then spread to others very quickly just because of a wind current. So it's very difficult for these regulations to work unless they are universal. And the only way that's going to happen is if there's either A, private bodies that actually make it work because people give a damn, or B, the state forces it. And we all know which one they've been trying to make work. And funnily enough, it doesn't work very well. So let's try the alternative. Let's have the private solution. Let's get some companies to actually build the auditing tools that need to be built to actually make sure these regulations are adhered to and that companies are certified in whatever pollution they do produce and are appropriately penalized for not updating their stock vehicles or whatever they need to do to make that happen. If people actually give a damn about the environment, make it private and there'll be a market for it.
Yeah, I kind of have just an interesting tidbit related to what you said about, it's not as simple as having laws that will, supposedly protect the air. I'm currently living in Seattle, Washington, a very leftist city that has all kinds of regulations and has, opposed oil drilling off its shores recently. And they make a huge deal of protecting the environment legislatively, including banning straws, one of the first places in the U.S. that jumped on that straw banning bandwagon. But anyhow, just a month ago, the whole city was blanketed in smoke from wildfires burning in Canada, and it really put a damper on the tourist economy here, with all kinds of people not wanting to come because what's normally a very beautiful view of the surrounding mountains and environment was completely obscured by this wildfire smoke that blew in here from Canada. So I mean, you can do all these things legislatively, but in the end, it's just not that simple.
Yeah, I mean it is absolutely ridiculous to think that because we enact the law, the environment will suddenly get better. It might get better locally if it's a local problem, if you and only a local problem and can only be dealt with in that way. But that'll be true for things like ground pollution or um, like deforestation or erosion. You can deal with that kind of problem locally to a fair extent. But when it comes to air pollution, the policies that have to be put in play have to be much, much larger because they're covering a huge, the entire planet, basically, in and trying to do it both in a macro and microcosm at the same time. It just won't work. I'm sorry, but it won't. Not by a single method. You have to have a market of ideas for that to actually function.
Definitely.
And I think it's time to, as we're rounding off a bit, I think it's time to hit some of these comments from Danielle Hatfield. Most drug side effects are scarier than the diseases they treat. It is so bloody true. I actually, because it's such a trope now on TV advertising that I had to look up to see if it actually was on TV tropes. And it is. Ask your doctor if happy pills are right for you. This commercial actually does tell you what the pill is for, and then spends the rest of the commercial breaking the bad news gently. If you have seasonal allergies, mixapilcaine may be right for you. Side effects of mixapilcaine are uncommon and include headache, nausea, vomiting, death, dizziness, vaginal ejaculations, dysentery, cardiac arrhythmia, mild heart explosions, varicose veins, darkened stool, darkened soul, lycanthropy, trucanthropy, more vomiting, arterial sclerosis, hemorrhoids, diabetes, virginities, mild discomfort, vampirism, gender impermanence, spontaneous dental hydroplosion, sugar high, even more vomiting, and a mild rash. Now, granted, these are like jokes, to be honest, but to be quite frank, I have seen commercials where they have come out with death as being something that is quite common as a side effect or a potential side effect. And it's usually the last one in that list because they always leave the worst to last. Hey, skip to the end. Skip. All right, yes, I'm murdering, and it's gonna kill me. I'm not gonna take it. That's the limit, unfortunately. Finian, shower and sleep work better for me when I have a headache, and water. Rarely get them though. Have to buy pills, so of course people are programmed to use pills right away. Coffee, lots of coffee from Gregory Patrick is a good solution. Poisonous amounts. St. John's College, which is in Annapolis, is embarking on a campaign that will reduce tuition costs. They're focusing on their endowment to do it. It's been around 56K and they're reducing it by about 20K. So there are campuses apparently that have paid attention to the fact that tuition is too fucking expensive for most people. And they're starting to actually use market pressure to drop the cost, which is the only way you will actually reduce education costs in America, specifically higher education. The EU is one talk. I'm assuming that's to do. That was from book 2. I'm assuming that was to do with how Hungary was behaved, because yeah, um, But yeah, the again from Daniel Hatfield. So what are they doing about pollution except taxing? What a joke. And then back to our previous comments. Death is a bigger dampener on taking an allergy med. And I have seen this commercial too. Yeah, it's bad. To prevent fever, you have to risk dysentery or diarrhea and potential death from, well, God knows what kind of symptoms. If you're experiencing that kind of side effect at all, don't take that drug. Simple as it's a very simple principle. But hey, but yeah, the as it was apparently I broke up. Finian, where did I crack up? Where was I? If you can quickly let me know. Can you hear me okay, Cryptic?
Yeah, I can hear you. I mean, you broke up a little bit, just mostly while you were reading just some of the last few comments there.
Fair enough. It might be something to do with my mic. Okay. Hopefully it won't continue. We'll speak goal. Again, I do advocate a lot that stuff is abandonware, but as long as it's in short bursts, apparently we're okay. But yeah, I mean, apart from all that, is there any other bits that you've seen recently that you think worth bringing up as a final piece? Was that article, I think, wasn't there?
There were a couple from the Free Thought Project. I think one quick update to the story of the cop shooting in Dallas. They just mentioned how recently the police strategically released the findings of their search warrant to say that the dead man had a little bit of marijuana in his apartment. But of course, no search warrants were served on the killer cop's apartment. And apparently, she recently vacated her apartment. Um, she moved out, so they won't be able to search her apartment now. So we'll just
Yeah,
keep following that story.
yeah. Actually, since you mentioned marijuana, why don't you finish off that story? Because it might be interesting for those of you who are pot is actually legalized, so you get some money off it.
Yeah. All right. So this story is from Politico by Louisa Savage. U.S. official Canadian marijuana users, workers, and investors risk lifetime border ban. Canadians who work in the marijuana industry and those who invest in the booming pot sector risk a lifetime ban on travel to the U.S., according to a senior official overseeing U.S. border operations. As Canada prepares to become the world's only major industrialized nation to legalize retail marijuana sales starting October 17, the Canadian cannabis sector is projected to generate billions of dollars of revenue in coming years, and Canadians have flocked to take jobs and buy stocks in the burgeoning industry. But the move has potential to disrupt border crossings between the US and Canada for travelers who run afoul of American drug laws, even if their activities are legal in Canada. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency will continue to apply long-standing U.S. federal laws and regulations that treat marijuana as a banned substance and participants in the cannabis industry as drug traffickers who are inadmissible into the U.S. Although some U.S. states have eased marijuana laws, the U.S. continues to maintain a federal prohibition that applies at the border, said Todd Owen, Executive Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Field Operations, who gave Politico a detailed preview of how CBP will apply long-standing rules. Here's exactly how it would work. CBP officials are not planning to go out of their way to interrogate every Canadian traveler about marijuana use. However, other factors may cause them to raise the topic. Our officers are not going to be asking everyone whether they have used marijuana, but if other questions lead there, or if there is a smell coming from the car, they might ask, Owen said. Likewise, marijuana residue, which can linger for weeks inside a car, could be detected by CBP inspection dogs and lead to further questioning. He noted, if asked about past drug use, travelers should not lie, he said. If you lie about it, that's fraud and misrepresentation, which carries a lifetime ban. If a traveler admits to past use of any illegal drugs, including marijuana, the traveler will be found to be inadmissible to the United States. CBP will typically allow them the opportunity to voluntarily withdraw from the border or face an expedited removal. Whether or not the traveler enters the U.S., a record will be kept by CBP and that traveler will not be allowed to return. Um, so, yeah, just
Lovely.
more ridiculousness. Yeah.
Find it interesting that you only have to worry about that apparently on the Canadian border. On the
Yeah.
Mexican border, I guess that wall will somehow make that magically, that set of questions magically disappear whenever it gets built, which will probably be never, let's be honest.
Yeah.
Because I mean, oh god, this one's just. I was making comments in chat, but I think I'll make them public as well. Um, Gotta love how the federal government is going out of its way to limit something legal in an increasing number of states within the union. If you think about it, most states right now say it's legal for medical use. To my knowledge, I mean, it's a very high majority of states have medicinalized it at their minimum. And I believe there are three now which have legalized it for sale. I know Washington State has in Colorado, and I think California now too. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, California they're just getting started, I think, this year or next year.
Yeah, I thought that they were on that. I was actually shocked to see that it was Colorado and Washington that came out with it before California, and I absolutely. It was the first time I actually smiled at the police in Washington State because when the act was signed, they basically put up a booth that said "Free Doritos." On the what was it, April 20th? So for 420 day.
Oh, that was in Colorado,
Oh, that was
actually.
in Colorado. I swear that was in Seattle. They did it too because they basically said just so that you keep your energy levels up over this special day for everybody. Here's some Doritos at this kiosk that we've set up for you. Signed the Seattle Police Department. And it was a little tweet that they put up, if I remember correctly. But if Colorado did it too, bully, because it just shows that the police are finally going. You know what? We're not gonna chase you for this. In fact, we'll give you something because, yeah, we've been probably screwing the pooch on this for a very long time, which is an important thing to pay attention to. And from Camp 002, this usually means full legalization is probably on the way. And I agree. I don't see it being that far away from a reality now. The social pressure against prohibition is very strong on most things in general. And it's only the Puritans of political correctness nowadays that seem to be pushing for further prohibitions of any kind because they're buying into the old lies.
Yeah, hopefully, for sure. I mean, it's still a pain, that some states it's totally, for sale and everything, and then other states still will arrest people over small amounts and extort them for fee fines and all that type of crap. But as you said, certain parts of the U.S. are have been for a while a lot more lax, and um, I mean, I just was straight up smoking pot outside one day, and two cops walked past me and didn't even like notice or care. So compared to if that was in one of the typical states where the drug war is still very highly important to their local cops, that wouldn't be the case. I'd definitely be out probably hundreds of dollars at least on fines.
At
So
least, if you're lucky,
yeah,
if not imprisoned for it.
yeah, and yeah. But what I will say though is one thing that irritates me, and this is just going further, is that so Washington State, Colorado, California. What sucks about Washington State is that they still will not allow people to grow their own pot, which just kind of feeds into their desperate, maniacal, money grabbing leftism that they have, where, they'll say, yeah, it'll be legal, but only if we're strictly regulating all the cannabis sellers and growers, and you'll be taxed and you can't grow your own to avoid our taxes. So certainly one thing to look for in the future is to make it completely free of state influence. Hopefully one day.
Yeah, fingers crossed, mate. Well, it's 5 minutes past the hour, so we've overran just slightly, but I think it's probably worth wrapping up around now. So, yeah. Well, as our great founder would say, bad morning, everybody. Smash the state and fuck the system. And yes, have a very bad morning.
Bad morning, guys.